6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we're joined by Casey Michel to discuss his brand new book, Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. I think this is such an important book and an important discussion that we're going to have today. But how are you, Casey?
Jackson, thanks so much for having me. It's very good to join you, and very nice to take a break from the day-to-day, hour-by-hour news cycle right now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Me and you were just discussing that, and probably not going to have hair left by the end of the week, yet alone.
Well, certainly the way things are going, I'm going to have no hair and certainly no retirement savings either, at least for those of us in the States. But yes, it's always an adventure.
Yeah, well, let's start on a slightly more positive note then. What inspired you to write this book? Because it is a massive undertaking.
Well, look, that's a great question, something I roll around with on my end every day. I mean, the book itself is about the broader history of what I describe as the foreign lobbying industry in the United States of America. And these are the American firms, the American lobbying firms and law firms and PR shops and consultancies and even former officials out of Congress and think tanks as well, that act as the kind of mouthpieces for, the foot soldiers for, even the henchmen for some of the most malign and malignant regimes around the world. These are the Americans that are not signing up American clients to lobby on their behalf in the United States of America and change, especially American foreign policy, but increasingly American domestic policy as well. These firms no longer work with American clients to do that. They work with dictatorial or authoritarian regimes and proxies abroad to create this now multi-billion-dollar industry right here in the United States of America. Almost all of it is perfectly legal, and it has just exploded over the past few years in terms of impact and influence. Again, some of which we see day-to-day in terms of the day-to-day news cycle itself. On my end, this goes back to when I was a much younger and more physically fit man than I am now, all the way back to my early 20s, right after I'd finished my my university, my undergraduate studies here in the United States. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with myself or with my time. I ended up becoming a member of the United States of America's Peace Corps, which here we are speaking on April 11th, 2025 is thankfully still in existence, although I'm not sure how much longer that will be the case. And I was placed in the wonderful, beautiful country of Kazakhstan, and I was living along the Kazakh-Russian border. I was an English teacher over there. It was a wonderful time. And I was, teaching young students, making local friends, and so on and so forth, and really, kind of exploring the state of the world as only someone in their early 20s can do. But that was my first time living and working and operating under a truly dictatorial, kleptocratic regime. And so on the one hand, I got to have kind of an inside look at how they were stealing from the local populations, the local infrastructure budget, local education budget. Beyond that, how they were moving much of that money abroad to places like Switzerland, places like the United Kingdom, as well as places like the United States of America. That ended up becoming the genesis of my first book, which looked at offshore and financial secrecy in the United States. But one other thing that they did was they would hire these fleets of lobbyists in places like the United States of America, in Washington, D.C., though I shouldn't say just Washington. They also hired a certain former British Prime Minister named Tony Blair, who became the best friend for the Kazakh dictator at the time. They were hiring all these lobbyists to go around the United States of America, go to members of Congress and American policymakers, and sing the praises of this decades-long kleptocratic dictatorship, which was immiserating populations across Kazakhstan. Again, I can see this with my own eyes, the impact this has on the ground in terms of schools not being built, hospitals not being built. Meanwhile, you have all of these paid-off American mouthpieces in the United States that are going around, again, whitewashing the reputation of this dictatorship. And that is really something that, I don't know what the term is, kind of stuck in my craw. That was a very frustrating dynamic to see play out. Because again, those are the Americans that can open up the doors for policymakers in Congress, policymakers in the White House. I was just a lowly English teacher in Kazakhstan. I had no influence or sway. I have only marginally more right now, many years later. But in terms of the genesis, the interest, and certainly the, if you'd like to use the term anger surrounding some of these dynamics, and who is taking advantage and what it means, not just for those in Kazakhstan or other places around the world, but increasingly in the United States of America. That's really where it came from. I ended up, Jackson, you and I were just talking off mic about grad school. I, fortunately or otherwise, have not gone the PhD route as of yet. We'll see if my wife allows that someday. But I did. I went to graduate school here in the States, here at Columbia University in New York, for what is termed Russian and post-Soviet studies. And at the time, my primary area of focus was how these post-Soviet dictatorships in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Russia as well, how they target and manipulate Western audiences or those in democratic polities, including the United States. But that was a wonderfully productive time, research focused. And then when I finished that in 2015, I thought to myself, well, that was fun. That'll never be relevant whatsoever ever again. I can go on to do other things which are far less stressful and let me sleep better at night. But here we are, a decade later, still talking about this. So that's the very long, convoluted way. I'm sorry for such a long, rambling response.
No. Don't apologize. I think it's really nice when you see authors, historians being able to combine their studies and their personal experiences to try and better the world or inform people more. But then, you're mentioning, those authoritarian dictators, those people who are seeking to try and empower themselves by exploiting their countries. But then people might not understand what lobbyists are, because we've got an audience all over the US, all over a very Western specific phenomenon.
Lobbying, the term itself is about a century and a half old. It goes back to the mid-19th century. It first originated in the United States of America. It's kind of a catch-all term for any kind of real influence peddling, as we understand it, among those who are outside of government, who are trying to influence those who are within government. Those citizens, those individuals or organizations in the private sector, even those individuals or organizations or, as we're talking about today, regimes that are trying to influence governmental policymakers in places like Washington, in places like London, in places like Brussels. It can take many different forms. It can be sit-down conversations. It can be paid for junkets. It can be emails. It can be letters. It can be visits to private islands. Anything and everything that can be used to try to influence those who are crafting policy in the United States or, again, of course, elsewhere. I know we'll be talking a lot about the U.S. today, but this is hardly an American phenomenon. That's really what we mean when we use the term lobbying. And I completely understand. And, of course, this book is highly critical of what we're going to talk about, the foreign lobbying industry in the U.S. And I completely understand why lobbying itself gets such a bad rap, both foreign and domestic. But in the American context, I do think it's worth reminding folks that right there in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is, again, the U.S. Constitution, a wonderful document, the First Amendment, a wonderful subset of rights for all Americans, American citizens and American nationals, the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and the freedom to assemble, those kind of bedrock liberal democracy freedoms. There's also a fifth clause, a fifth freedom within that First Amendment, and that is the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which is just an old-timey, old-fashioned way of saying any American citizen or American national has the constitutionally protected right to go to any member of government that they want, local legislator, folks in Congress, or even the White House itself, and advocate for whatever policy they want to see pursued. And again, it can be environmental policy, healthcare policy, increased funding for PhD students, whatever it is. If you are in the United States of America, you have the constitutionally protected right to do that, which is to say, you can freely and legally lobby anyone at any time for any reason. So that's the kind of underlying legal context and construct in the United States. Of course, there are different legal constructs around the world, but in the U.S., that is why lobbying has been allowed to flourish as it has into this now multi-billion-dollar industry, not just over the past few years, but over the past few decades, but really going back at least a century, if not even further back into American history. That's kind of what lobbying really is and why it is protected.
And it seems like such a powerful tool, but also something that can be concentrated in the hands of relatively few people. So how does it begin, and how does such a small number of people get such a outbalanced level of influence?
So this is again a centuries-long story. I'll try to keep it relatively concise so we can get to some other parts of the conversation as well, Jackson. In the United States of America, lobbying goes really back to the founding of the American Republic. Again, the passage of the American Constitution, the ratification of the American Constitution in the 1780s, the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War. The real first instance we see of this kind of organized lobbying effort in the U.S. is in the early 70s, when there is one gentleman who organizes a number of Revolutionary War veterans who are just trying to get back pay from the new American government for their efforts during the war. It's not an innocent origin story for lobbying in and of itself. Of course, this was the aftermath of a horrifically bloody war, but you can see how it is and why it is that someone would use those newfound freedoms in the American Constitution to lobby for something like this, which in the eyes of American legislators was certainly a very worthwhile activity. And then lobbying kind of continued like this. It was generally these kind of one-off efforts for either economic considerations or other public considerations that didn't have any kind of organized superstructure behind it. We didn't see lobbying firms as such emerge until decades after the founding of the United States of America. You certainly had lobbying scandals emerge, especially after the American Civil War, 1860s, 1870s. There's one that I write about, which, as far as I could tell, was the first very real foreign lobbying scandal in American history. And this was in 1867, right after the American Civil War. And I know this is a history podcast. I'm glad we can get a little bit into the weeds of this, because this is really where I like to nerd out. But you think about the United States of America, 1865, the Civil War ends. The place is absolutely decimated, especially across the American South. Political fractures are all over the place. And one theory that American officials have, especially Secretary of State William Seward, is in terms of patching up this shattered United States of America, why not look to expansion and expansionism abroad? And not just in the American West, the lands that have been seized from Mexico or Oregon Territory, but look to places like Alaska, which at the time was still controlled by Tsarist Russia. The other part of that coin is that Tsarist Russia was at that point relatively broke from losing the Crimean War and had a number of failed investments in North America, including Alaska, and was looking to offload that. Did not want to sell it to the Brits because they did not want to see the expansion of British Canada. They would prefer to sell it to the Americans. The problem, though, was that outside of the Secretary of State's office, almost no Americans really wanted Alaska. They didn't see the value of it. It was not contiguous to the United States of America. Someone described it, a contemporary journalist described it as a polar bear garden. Right? There was basically nothing there. They didn't know about the oil. They didn't know about the gold, so on and so forth. So what ends up happening is that the Tsarist ambassador to the United States starts what we would perfectly well recognize as an illicit foreign lobbying campaign. He starts taking money and hiring former American officials, former members of the American cabinet. He starts paying off American journalists, all of whom are suddenly praising this potential purchase of Alaska, saying this is the best thing that the U.S. could do. Don't worry that there's nothing that we know of there. Don't worry, it's just polar bears. We got to do it. And no, by the way, of course, we're not taking any money to say this whatsoever. We're doing this from the goodness of our heart. Now, lo and behold, this ends up working. The United States of America purchases Alaska in 1867. The rest is kind of history, but there's one interesting nugget, which is, one of these questions we'll probably never get an answer to, is that there was an investigation in Congress afterward about some of this foreign lobbying money floating around Washington. And one thing that they apparently discovered, they never quite got the paper trail for this, but by all appearances, it looked like it wasn't just former members of Congress being paid off and journalists being paid off. It looked like the Russians were directly bribing multiple members of Congress to vote to annex Alaska. And again, you've been following the news as much as anyone over the last 10 years. Of course, Russian influence, Russian interference has been front and center for years now. But this is a playbook that goes all the way back to the 1860s when we're talking about foreign lobbying, the kind of playbook that emerged that we now see. Anyways, Jackson, that was a detour, blah, blah, blah. The rest of the 19th century continues. And then it really is by the early 20th century that we see what modern lobbying begins flourishing into with a figure like Ivy Lee, who I know you had some questions about.
I think it's really interesting with that, the history repeating, rhyming kind of thing, because you have, Tsarist Russia isn't so different from Putin's Russia today. And that kind of playbook being written, still being able to continue. But then, You mentioned dictatorial regimes, Ivy League, and the playbook these regimes can utilize. How do dictatorial regimes of the 20th century, the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, start to try and influence American politics?
Well, I was going to say, Jackson, just to your point about history rhyming, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir right now, but it is why it's so important to have the kind of conversations like you have on this podcast, to be able to pursue the broader sweep, the broader topic of history itself, to examine how these topics do end up rhyming, and of course, the policy outcomes therein, but also to see what is new in terms of, here we are in the mid-2020s, what is new about for instance, Donald Trump's usage of executive orders and so on and so forth. But, that's a further future conversation. Dictatorial and totalitarian regimes of the 20th century began lobbying in the United States of America in the 1920s. There's one figure in particular I focus on in the book, a gentleman named Ivy Lee. Now, some folks may have heard of Ivy Lee. He's not technically an unknown character. He's still best remembered for effectively inventing the public relations industry, which is, of course, now its own multi-billion-dollar industry. And he really can claim title to that. He invented the first press release. He created the first crisis management playbook, and he used it across the United States of America in the late 19th, early 20th century with wild success, which I think just speaks to who his clients were, right? It was the Rockefellers. He was working with Charles Schwab. He was working with politicians like Woodrow Wilson were hiring him to try to improve their public image and increase their standing either financially or politically. And it's not until after World War I that Ivy Lee realizes he doesn't have to work just with domestic clients. He can turn internationally. And again, I think it's worth remembering the context of the post-World War I era, especially on the European continent, is that there are a whole series of new governments and new nations emerging that are, of course, just trying to survive on their own, but also trying to identify and navigate the halls of power in places like the United States of America to gain American support for their governments, for their governmental programs, and for their regimes. And they realize, it's kind of this meeting of the minds, really. You have Ivy Lee realizing he no longer has to work with just American clients. And then you have these new governments emerging in Europe that realize, well, we've seen what Ivy Lee can do domestically. Could he also help us in the international context? And the next thing you know, there's Ivy Lee gallivanting around post-war Europe, signing up client after client after client. And again, not committing any crimes. There's nothing illegal that he's doing. But going to them and saying, I can help you lobby. I can help you improve your standing in Washington, D.C. Of course, you'll have to pay me for my services, but I will absolutely help you gain significant American support for your programs and your projects. And government after government signs him up. Unfortunately, it's not just democratic governments in places like the UK or France, but it is newly fascist regimes like those in Rome under Benito Mussolini. It is newly communist, expansionist regimes in places like the Soviet Union in Moscow. And by the early 1930s, it is also a rising regime in Berlin called the Nazis, all of whom have hired Ivy Lee to be their man in Washington, to lobby on their behalf, to give them talking points, to deflect criticism, to open doors, and to impact policy decisions in Washington, D.C. These are the governments that see what Ivy Lee has done and want to hire him, and that really create the origins of the foreign lobbying industry itself in the United States.
Reading the story of Ivy Lee, I was certainly struck by an almost immoral strand to his character.
It's funny because you write a book like this, and of course morality is front and center for so much of this. For lack of a better term, that was one of the reasons I ended up writing on these topics in the first place. And to the point that Ivy Lee, yes, absolutely. I think it hopefully comes through clearly in the book itself that morals were never a consideration. Even political ideology was never a true consideration. You see him signing up the fascists, you see him signing up the communists. I mean, you could not get further from one another. Of course, the through line there is simply authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And I know I'm fast forwarding here a little bit, but the questions of morality and what I ended up finding certainly have their use. But at the end of the day, if I'm a lobbying firm in the 21st century, if I'm a lobbying firm looking to sign up clients, you can be as moral as you want in this space, and you can turn down the Russias or the Chinas or the Venezuelas or the Hungaries or whomever it is. You can certainly do that. But unfortunately, given the legal allowances and given the now sprawling network of lobbying firms out there, they're just going to go. Those clients are just going to go to another firm that's eventually going to say yes. Your competition is going to be the one making the money. You're going to be losing out. And yes, again, you can have all the morals that you want, but you see these kind of incentive structures emerge, which is undercutting morality at every turn. And of course, much of this goes back to the origins with Ivy League saying, sure, I'll sign up whoever I want, regardless of the impact on the ground.
So when we're looking at, like, regardless of, the impact, how successful is he in trying to get these guys whitewashed? Because, Nazis aren't doing particularly nice things in the 30s, neither the Soviets.
So the answer to that is relatively successful. Of course, by the time World War II breaks out, yes, the U.S. is allied with the Soviets, but of course, we're also fighting the Axis powers in Berlin and Germany. So in that sense, he wasn't ultimately successful. But certainly at the time that he was working, and he ended up dying in the mid-1930s, so he actually didn't see the war. But through the 20s and the early 30s, I would say by his metrics, he was wildly successful. So on the one hand, here he is really helping introduce the American public to Benito Mussolini, claiming that Mussolini is restoring Italian prominence, Italian greatness, and certainly the Italian economy. With the Soviet Union, he is pushing back. He's really one of the few people in the United States of America trying to push back against this overwhelming tide of anti-Soviet, understandably anti-Soviet position. He's actually saying, look, no, we need to not put the Soviets to the side and ignore them. We need to go there with open arms and form investment partnerships, new economic deals. It's funny, you talk about history rhyming. Just this morning, I'm reading about an American official going to Moscow to meet with Kremlin officials to talk about welcoming the Russians back in from the cold on the basis of these new investment partnerships. But that's, again, just history rhyming right there. I really ends up being a central figure in convincing the Americans to finally formally recognize the USSR. And when the Americans do that, the Soviet foreign minister actually sends Ivy League a note directly thanking him for his work in convincing the Americans to recognize them. And then by the mid-1930s, he's working with the Nazis. And look, he dies relatively early into the Nazi regime. So if it had been late 1930s, early 1940s, we would have considered that a failure. But at the time, he helped push back against any overwhelming American criticism of the rise of Adolf Hitler, of the rise of the Nazi regime as well, saying that Hitler is he's a leader worth supporting, or at least not worth opposing. Again, he's restoring German greatness, restoring the German economy. He's someone we should at least hear out, rather than try to put the brakes on and try to try himself. And of course, all the while, Ivy League is making staggering amounts of money. I mean, he's already perfectly wealthy, but now he's getting even wealthier in the process.
I think that's something to add to that as well, is that this is not something that people are doing because they're supportive of these regimes.
Sometimes they do. Every once in a while they do. But more generally, they do it for one reason alone. That's the money, right? It's the money that they're making. It's the money that the competitors are not going to make. And of course, at the end of the day, they're not committing any crimes whatsoever, absent a few other individuals who I'm sure we'll talk about later in this conversation. Yeah, they make a lot of money doing this.
So with the kind of financial bit kind of running away, showing these men getting incredibly rich, how does the American system, because politics is rather reactive, how does it seek to kind of react to this rise in lobbying?
So in the mid-1930s, there were a series of congressional hearings among American policymakers who realized that Ivy League, as well as a number of others, were perhaps not simply praising Adolf Hitler or Mussolini or the Soviets, simply because they wanted to do that. That's how they wanted to spend their time. Perhaps they were being paid to do so. And as the book details, there's one hearing in particular when they bring Ivy League in, and initially it's very cordial. They all know who Lee is. They've been working with him for years and years. They know exactly what he's all about. But as the hearing goes along, there are a number of legislators who begin digging into the financial arrangements, and what they realize is that Ivy League is just a paid mouthpiece for the Nazis in Berlin, and an incredibly successful one at that. Now, Lee dies shortly thereafter, so there aren't any subsequent hearings. But what ends up happening is that the American government, for the very first time in American history, passes legislation restricting, or not restricting, but bringing some kind of disclosure standards to lobbyists in the United States of America, and in particular foreign lobbyists. Again, I rattled off all that stuff a few minutes ago about the constitutional arrangements and protections for lobbying. They can't ban these practices, but they can try to bring some transparency to this sector, and that's exactly what they do in 1938 when they passed the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is, as many things in Washington are, known only by its acronym of FARA, F-A-R-A. It's a simple piece of legislation. It just says these foreign lobbyists have to disclose what they're doing and who they're doing it for and how much money they're making. They don't have to stop. They don't have to turn down any specific regimes. They can work wherever, with whoever they want. They just have to share that information. And of course, that legislation was passed right before World War II. And, I fast forwarding a few decades, it's great in theory. It's a wonderful piece of legislation in theory. But it turns out during the Cold War and really throughout the rest of the 20th century, American officials, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this, I kind of didn't give a shit about foreign lobbying. They didn't care about foreign lobbying. They never saw what a threat it could present. They never understood why FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, should be enforced. They just didn't care. Again, it's American dominance, it's American primacy, certainly by the late 20th, early 21st century. Why would we ever care about these foreign lobbyists running around Washington? We're the kings of the hill. No one could ever possibly topple us. Who cares?
Yeah, and I think that's a very a very American government kind of style of thinking in that. And then I definitely think there's that figure, Paul Manafort, who kind of shows that you should care about it. And he's probably a name many of us recognise. But could you just detail for us, those who don't know, who this man?
Yeah. So Paul Manafort, I'm sure plenty of listeners are familiar with him. He was best known for being Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager, for helping launch Donald Trump to the White House in the first place. But he had a long career before that, where he was not a presidential campaign manager, but he was a lobbyist. First for domestic clients in the United States of America, through the 1980s and the 90s, and then by the turn of the century for foreign clients as well. His story, and I got very lucky in this, his story ends up mirroring in many ways Ivy Lee's story and narrative arc of those two beginning to work in the domestic space and really kind of inventing or reinventing modern lobbying domestically, then extending to the foreign space and signing up all these foreign clients. And then just as they're reaching the apex of their reputation and influence, it all comes crashing down. For Manafort, he began domestically working for a number of Republican officials, and then he ended up working for a number of private companies and really creating this kind of loop where you can get folks, you can be a political consultant, get folks into office, and then you can go be a more traditional lobbyist and hire private clients by saying, look, I can open the doors to those officials themselves. I can get you in if you pay me. And then going back to the officials and saying, look, you need re-election donations, you need campaign financing. I can go to my private clients and I can work on their behalf. And so I can get the money from them so that you can remain in office. He really creates this entire kind of loop that begins building and building and building on itself. And there's one researcher I cite in the book who says that Paul Manafort really created the quote unquote swamp as we know it, which of course Donald Trump is always railing about draining the swamp. Anyways, then he ends up going abroad. He ends up signing clients in places like Angola and Somalia and Nigeria, the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos. Again, these are not by any stretch of the imagination democratic allies or democratic governments. And then most notoriously and spectacularly, he goes to Ukraine through the 2000s and early 2010s and ends up becoming extremely close, one of, if not the closest advisors to a Ukrainian politician named Viktor Yanukovych, who, Jackson, I'm sure you remember, I'm sure many of the listeners also remember, was the Ukrainian president in the early 2010s. He's elected in 2010 and ends up being tossed out of power because of his clear autocratic and pro-Kremlin leanings. He's, if nothing else, kind of a pro-Kremlin figure that ended up as president of Ukraine, ends up tossed out of power in 2014 during Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution, which in many ways is still ongoing, and of course still with us to this day. That was Paul Manafort's real fall from grace right there until Donald Trump announced in 2015 he was going to be launching a campaign to the White House. Paul Manafort at the time was sitting in a rehab clinic. His family had fallen apart. His finances had fallen apart. But he realized that Donald Trump needed someone like him, and he ended up reaching out. Donald Trump signed him up. and got him into the White House in 2016. And we have been dealing with the aftermath of that ever since.
And I think something that strikes me as incredibly interesting in Manafort's story is that he kind of shows that it's not just, and I think a lot of people are guilty about this, saying it's not just Republicans who are taking this.
This is not a bipartisan, this is not a partisan issue. This is not something only Republicans or even only Democrats do. This has absolutely been one of the reasons this has been such a difficult topic to combat, to disentangle, to make any progress on whatsoever. It's because it is absolutely across the board. I think that's one of the things, and again, I don't know if lucky is quite the right word, but one of the reasons that I ended up focusing on the Manafort story itself is because of the network he created for himself, that he oversaw the creation of in Ukraine in the early 2010s, as these pro-Russian interests were entrenching themselves and trying to subjugate Ukraine, which of course ended up blowing up in 2014. Because it wasn't just Manafort who was there. He brought in a number of other Republican allies with him, but he also brought in a number of Democrats. He ended up signing up a law firm in the United States of America whose primary point person in, again, whitewashing the reputation of this Ukrainian thug, this Ukrainian pro-Kremlin figure, was a gentleman named Gregory Craig, who, he's not a well-known figure, but he was the White House counsel for Barack Obama. Another gentleman that Paul Manafort brings in was the campaign manager for Bernie Sanders in 2016. So again, you have this across-the-board spectrum of folks that Manafort is bringing together, cobbling together, to create this network of enablers, all for the express purpose of entrenching this crooked, corrupt, kleptocratic, pro-Kremlin, it's a tongue twister, regime in Ukraine. All, of course, they're all getting paid in the process. None of them have any considerations for American interests, national security, or, of course, Ukrainian democracy itself. They all just want to get paid. And we see where that ends up blowing up into. But yeah, that's a microcosm for the broader sweep of how this exists across the American political spectrum.
And that huge amount of wealth and a bipartisan kind of approach to it, it seems that there's a lack of balance in it, working with democratic regimes and dictatorial regimes. Within it, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, regimes across Southeast Asia. Why is it that there is a disproportionate number of dictatorships trying to access these people?
Well, certainly there are, again, here we're speaking in 2025, a disproportionate number of dictatorships and authoritarian governments in and of themselves globally. Something like 70-75% of the world lives under non-democratic regimes. So in that sense, it makes sense why there would be a disproportionate amount. But the other element of it is because some of these most kleptocratic regimes, whether it's the Saudis or the Emiratis, certainly the Russians, increasingly places like Turkey or even China, those regimes have access to effectively bottomless pots of wealth that they can tap into to splurge and spend on whichever American lobbyists they want. So whereas there are transparency mechanisms in London or in Paris or in Oslo or Ottawa, whatever it might be, those do not exist whatsoever in the authoritarian governments in places like Gabon or Rwanda or Zambia, or you name it. So in that sense, there's more money available to them. I suspect it's also because they have found greater success. Let me phrase it this way. That money has opened doors that I don't think these regimes ever expected, ever thought they could possibly open. I think what regime after regime after regime has learned over the past 10, 15, 20 years, even longer, is that, unfortunately, in the United States of America, anyone and everyone has a price. And so long as that price is, as long as you're willing to meet that price, you can find friends wherever you need them. And again, these are traditional lobbying firms. These are leading PR and consultancy firms. These are leading think tanks. These are leading universities. And of course, these are leading members of Congress or the former White House itself. And I know I've mentioned former officials a few times. I think it's worth highlighting, Jackson, as you might have seen in the afterword of the book itself. And again, getting back to the bipartisan nature of this, late last year, we did have the very first conviction in American history of not a former member of Congress, but a then current member of Congress, being found guilty of conspiring to act as a foreign agent on behalf of a dictatorship. And it wasn't Donald Trump, it wasn't some other Republican, it was a Democrat named Bob Menendez, who was, up until that point, the most powerful senator in the United States of America in terms of crafting American foreign policy. Turns out he was also moonlighting as effectively a mole or a spy, or whatever term you like to use, for the Egyptian military dictatorship, all in return for some clandestine payments, including literal bars of gold that he was hiding in his bedroom. And according to prosecutors, later Googling how much does a gold bar cost. So hopefully he found an answer to that, because yeah, he was found guilty as a Democrat on behalf of the Egyptian government just a few months ago.
I think that's really important to mention there, because often we think of those clandestine payments and gold bars hidden under beds as some far off scene from a 1960s spy movie, but it's it's something that's happening today. But then I want to pull upon that university thread. I actually think that one's incredibly important as well. How is that impacting the way that people can conduct their research and disseminate it as well?
Sure. The book itself goes into some of the details. Excuse me, I should say our next report at the Human Rights Foundation, where my day job, is going to be focused more broadly on the topic of universities in the United States of America, because it turns out that universities, among other elements of the American nonprofit sector, but universities especially, have become a clear target for foreign regimes that are looking to, on the one hand, launder their image, transform the regimes from autocratic, bloody tyrants to benefactors of the arts, benefactors of education, and philanthropists writ large. That's one element of it. Another element is accessing proprietary research at leading American universities. And again, these are some of the most nominally elite universities in the U.S., the Yales and the Harvards and the Stanfords, which have been targeted over and over by these foreign regimes, which are either through gifts or significant contracts able to access that proprietary research on everything from financial policy to semiconductor development to quantum mechanics and AI. They're able to identify and target and then later exfiltrate some of that research itself. And of course, you also have these kind of interpersonal networks where American universities are not only educating future American policymakers and future American officials, but are all too often the kind of halfway houses for former officials who, having been voted out of office, now they need something to do, become professors, be chairs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this money opens doors for all of these regimes, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Chinas, but even the kind of the second tier, right, the Rwandans and the Egyptians and the Libyans and so on, to do anything and everything they really want at these universities. And we now know, because there are transparency requirements, this has been worth billions of dollars. The spoiler for the forthcoming report is that, by our estimate, about $18 billion over just the last 10 years has flowed from authoritarian or autocratic regimes to American universities, and again, opened all these doors in the process.
That's such a huge amount of cash going that way. But you mentioned the transparency laws, and then you also mentioned within the book the Lobbying Disclosure Act. These kind of reactive policies against the rise of foreign agents and lobbying. How effective have they been?
What term should I use here? Not at all. Negligibly. By and large, they've hardly been worth the paper that they have been written on. Look, there's a series of regulations surrounding lobbying in the United States now. We already talked about the Foreign Agents Registration Act. You just mentioned the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which was one that was passed in the 1990s, when, again, American policymakers, kind of in the glow of American victory during the Cold War and the belief that it's private market forces can lead directly to democratization, they passed this thing called the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which made it such that private companies, those that are not technically governmental organizations abroad, if they're lobbying in the United States, they don't have to disclose what other foreign lobbyists have to disclose. They don't have to disclose how much money they're making. They don't have to disclose who they're meeting with. It's this wonderful kind of loophole that they created by saying, well, look, yeah, sure, foreign governments are going to lobby in the United States of America, but surely no non-governmental organization, surely no private company in, I don't know, Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan or Thailand or whatever authoritarian government you like, surely they would never be a governmental cutout that would be doing the government's bidding in these regimes abroad. Surely that would never happen. That's one element of it. And again, you see these regulations taking place, but you see these unintended consequences that follow, like the Lobbying Disclosure Act. But all of this is taking place under the broader kind of umbrella of them not really enforcing these in the first place. And it's really not until the late 2010s that even things like the Foreign Agents Registration Act sees any kind of enforcement, any kind of concern or considerations. Yeah, disappointingly, you can have all the laws that you want on the books, all the regulations, but if no one's paying attention, if no one cares, I mean, then what the fuck are they worth, right? What are these actually doing at the end of the day, besides apparently decimating American foreign policy and now American democracy?
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of history, actually, because this has been going on for hundreds of years, and people have just been ignoring it because they don't see it as the pressing concern at that point.
Look, I'm a proud, patriotic American. I also know that there is a, shall we say, certain strain of American arrogance that we see as a through line throughout much of American history that offers, it not only pushes allies away, it not only hampers American interests writ large, but it's this kind of, the term I want to use is soporific. It's kind of the soporific effect where it makes us more lethargic and uninterested in and unaware of the kind of threats that can emerge through these perfectly legal allowances by saying, again, no one would dare touch us, no one would dare try to topple us, no one would dare try to work against our interests, including right here in the United States of America. And that applies perfectly well to the foreign lobbying space that we know regime after regime after regime has taken full advantage of. And plenty of Americans have grown spectacularly wealthy as a result of it in the process. But again, now you see what the price the rest of us have to pay for this. And it's on a day-to-day basis at this point.
Now, I think that's a good point now for us to go for our final fun question, because I know we've got so many other avenues that we can explore and we can talk for hours off this. You mentioned earlier in the podcast, you were part of the Peace Corps, volunteering in Kazakhstan. Now, I'm a massive foodie, so I want to know, what was your favourite food or meal when you're over there?
Jason, have you been to Kazakhstan yet? Have you had a chance to visit?
No, it's on my bucket list.
For your listeners, please put this, both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. I cannot recommend enough visiting. Of course, the people, of course, the cultural history, but also just the natural beauty of it all. Let me put that front and center recommendation. The national dish of Kazakhstan, it's called besh barmak, which translates to 5 fingers in Kazakh. It's a pasta dish, these kind of broad pasta noodles, and the meat that they use in it is horse, and smoked horse. And I had the opportunity to have it when I was in Kazakhstan, and it was absolutely delicious. Now, I may have been a few shots of vodka in at the point, but that's beside the point. I would like to recommend, if you get a chance to visit Kazakhstan, at least once, try the national dish. Try some besh barmak, try some smoked horse. It's not for everyone. It comes with, the other traditional drink is fermented mare's milk, which I did not care for. But yes, the smoked horse was quite tasty.
That sounds like a really, really interesting answer. I think that's the most interesting answer we've had so far.
Well, it was an interesting time. I can certainly say that.
And then obviously we've left so much on the cutting table now. We could have spoken about Roger Stone, we could have spoken more about Ivy Lee and the Russians, but where can people get a copy of Foreign Agents if they want to learn more about that?
Or they can get it at any of their favorite bookstores. It's certainly available online. Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Buy it for your friends, buy it for your enemies. I know Christmas is a ways off. It's a great stocking stuffer. But yeah, available where all books are sold.
And then if people want to go and interact with you, where can they go?
Well, I always recommend either following me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, but certainly going to the Human Rights Foundation's website, hrf.org. You can learn more about what I do at our Combating Kleptocracy program, but more generally, what our wonderful organization does as well in terms of supporting those who are on the front lines against dictators around the world. Again, many of whom have these American lobbying friends that are trying to destabilize and damage democracy wherever they can.
Well, I think that's a really, really important work to be doing. So I'll make sure everything is in the description below so people can go away and learn about that project, learn about you, and grab a copy. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jackson. This was great.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.